During the Vietnam War, the U.S. government rolled out this quiet social experiment. It was sold as this great opportunity, a path to a better life for America's poorest. But for hundreds of thousands of men, it ended up being a one-way ticket to the front lines and a lifetime of struggle. This is the story of Project 100,000.
So, to really understand the human cost of this whole thing, we're not going to start with some dry government report. Nope, we're going to start with a person.
Let's meet Maurice Williams. Now, to be clear, Maurice is a composite of many real soldiers' stories, but his experience is devastatingly common. He grew up poor on a farm way out in rural North Carolina.
So in 1969, right at the peak of the Vietnam War, Maurice gets drafted. Now, he'd actually scored pretty low on the military entrance exam, a score that just a few years before would have made him totally ineligible. But the rules had just changed.
And almost immediately, he was shipped off to the front lines in Vietnam. While he was out on a mission, he got hit by shrapnel from an enemy rocket. He managed to survive the physical injury, but the invisible wounds of war, well, those were just starting to take hold.
And right here, this is the turning point. After he got back to the States, he started having outbursts, showing up late, things we now easily recognize as classic symptoms of untreated PTSD. But back then, the Army just called it minor misconduct, and for that, they kicked him out with an other-than-honorable discharge.
That single piece of paper basically became a life sentence. For more than 50 years, Maurice was completely shut out from VA healthcare, housing benefits, you name it. He bounced between jobs, even experienced homelessness. He was objectively worse off than if he had never even served his country in the first place.
So how in the world did this happen? Not just to Maurice, but to the 354,000 other men who were in the exact same boat. Well, the answer isn't on a battlefield in Vietnam. It's in the political crisis that was brewing back in Washington.
By the time we get to the mid-1960s, the Vietnam War is escalating, and the U.S. government has a massive problem on its hands.
Monthly draft calls were just skyrocketing. President Lyndon Johnson was desperate for more soldiers, but he made a really critical political move. He decided he would not activate the National Guard or the reserves. Why? Because doing that would mean calling up the sons of the powerful, politically connected middle class, and that risked a huge backlash against the war.
And this just laid bare how unequal the draft system was. I mean, if you were from a well-off family, you could get a deferment for college. The Guard and Reserves basically became draft havens. All this meant that the real burden of the war fell squarely on the shoulders of America's poor and working-class families. And to make things worse, a full third of all young men were considered unqualified to serve, which created a serious manpower shortage.
So, what do? How do you fight a bigger war without angering the very voters you need to stay in power? Well, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara came up with an answer that, on the surface, looked like an absolute stroke of genius. And it even fit right in with President Johnson's war on poverty.
In a speech in 1966, McNamara used some pretty revealing language. He said his plan would salvage the subterranean poor. He basically argued that the military would be the world's greatest educator, uplifting these men with skills and discipline, getting them ready for productive lives.
This was Project 100,000, and the plan itself was mechanically pretty simple. The Department of Defense just drastically lowered the mental and physical standards you needed to get in, and with that one change, suddenly hundreds of thousands of previously ineligible men, guys just like Maurice Williams, were available for the draft.
But underneath that feel-good promise was some cold, hard political math. The program solved the manpower crisis. It allowed the war to keep going without having to draft middle-class college kids and risk a massive political firestorm. The burden of the fighting could now be shifted to those with the least amount of political power.
McNamara promised these men skills, a leg up, a brighter future. But the reality for the men of Project 100,000 was a brutal and, way too often, a fatal betrayal.
The most staggering thing about the program was just how racially skewed it was. At the time, black soldiers made up about 9% of the military as a whole, but they accounted for a jaw-dropping 40% of the men in Project 100,000. Civil rights leaders back then, like Congressman Adam Clayton Powell Jr., even called it genocide.
And these soldiers, who were officially called the New Standards Men, weren't just drafted disproportionately. No, they were funneled directly into the most dangerous jobs. 40% of them were assigned to combat roles. And the result? Their fatality rate in Vietnam was 3 times higher than other American soldiers.
And for the ones who survived the war, a whole different kind of life sentence was often waiting for them.
From minor issues, stuff that was often a direct result of trauma and PTSD, they were handed an other than honorable discharge. Now, this isn't a criminal conviction, but it acts like a permanent scarlet letter.
And this one single document had a devastating domino effect. An other than honorable discharge strips you of your legal status as a veteran. That means no VA healthcare, no housing loans, no educational benefits. It creates a lifetime of struggling to find a job, of dealing with social stigma. It was, for all intents and purposes, a punishment that never really ended.
For decades, this whole injustice has been pretty much forgotten. But the legal scholarship that this explainer is based on has uncovered not just the history, but also a clear, totally achievable path toward justice.
The solution is called presumptive discharge relief. It's a simple two-step process. First, the Department of Defense identifies if a veteran was part of Project 100,000. Second, they check if the veteran's record is free of any serious misconduct. If both of those things are true, the other than honorable discharge is automatically presumed to be unjust and it can be upgraded, finally restoring their benefits and their dignity.
And what's so compelling here is that this isn't some crazy new idea. This exact model was successfully used to correct the records of thousands of veterans who were unjustly discharged under the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. It's a proven blueprint for fixing a past wrong, and it can be done by the Department of Defense right now, without needing a new law from Congress.
Which brings us to the final and really the central question. For over half a century, these men have lived with the consequences of a program that used them to solve a political problem and then just discarded them. So after all this time, isn't it finally time to acknowledge this injustice and restore what was taken from the forgotten soldiers of Project 100,000?